So we'll talk about the monthly space news and also do a little bit of a year-end summary. After all, it is the beginning of a new year. So we talked a little bit about the James Webb Space Telescope last time. Essentially, you've heard some of the presentation already because Doug Hall gave an excellent presentation last time about it. So I'll focus mainly on things related to the progress, how it's doing. It was launched on the 25th from French Guiana on an Ariane 5 rocket. Think of it as a successor to the Hubble Space Telescope. It's 100 times more powerful than the Hubble Space Telescope. Most of the risk in this thing was actually not in the launch, which is unusual compared to most space exploration kind of things. Usually you think the launch is the most dangerous part. Not so here. Very, very complex, and I'll get into that a little bit. The unfolding of those solar shades and that sort of thing, extremely complicated. The big summary is so far so good. In fact, they may be, as we speak, they may be completing the final stages of deployment of the primary mirrors there, which is the last major step. So we'll find out probably by the end of the day. Just a reminder where it's going. It's going pretty far from Earth. You think where Hubble is out there on this diagram, it's indistinguishable from Earth. It's just a couple hundred miles above Earth. This thing is out 1 million miles out at the L2 point. Why there? Well, the L2 point, remember, think of that as it rotates with the Earth. So the rotational period is exactly a year, the same as the Earth compared to the sun. So it's always in the shadow of the Earth. And you think about normally the further out you go, the slower you expect it to be going, linear distance or linear velocity. But because of the combined effect of the Earth and the sun's gravity, in effect, there's more pull, and that's why it can end up going faster, even though it's further out from the sun. So that's one way to think about this L2 point. It's kind of special that way. Now, it doesn't actually orbit at the L2 point. If it did that, it wouldn't be able to communicate with Earth periodically because the Earth and the sun and the moon are all on the same plane. And so periodically, the moon would block the path of communications to Earth. So instead, you actually rotate out of the plane you in a circle around the L2 point. And that way, you always have communications with Earth, so the pictures can be transmitted back. So anyway, it's 1 million miles out, and of course we're showing here the way it actually would be oriented. This is an infrared space telescope, so of course heat is a real problem. It kind of gets in the way of detecting anything. So they want to make sure there's a very, very cold side where the primary mirrors are, and then all this other stuff is essentially just reflecting the sun. In terms of the schedule of this thing, from launch out to the final orbit, we got about a month roughly from launch till the time it reaches the orbital insertion point here. And we're already pretty far along that. The telescope is supposed to be completely unfolded. Right now, or to say when it's launched, it's all packed up and folded like some kind of complicated origami kind of a thing. And there's not that much room inside of a nose cone of a rocket. So it has to unfold. And this was a really incredibly complicated one. I'll show on the next slide. During this month on the way to L2, it's been unfolding itself, and that's almost done. And then after that, then they start turning things on the instruments. They're still waiting for it to cool. They'll be waiting for it to cool down even more. Again, an infrared telescope, you want to make sure everything is really, really cold. This is an adaptive optics kind of telescope, meaning every single one of those little hexagonal plates, the mirrors on the primary mirror here, they have to be adjusted one at a time, and it takes a long time to get that set up. So it'll take about 4 to 6 months, and then after that, it'll really be ready. So what's the status? Okay, well, right off the bat, once they get launched, they have to deploy the solar power arrays to power everything that's going to happen after that. They did that. They deployed a main antenna for communications. They extended the tower that holds up the primary mirror. And this is a space telescope. So remember, the way that works is the light comes in, it hits the primary mirrors, is bounced toward the secondary mirror, and then it's focused in at the sensors in the center of the thing. So they put the tower up, but that's just a tower. Everything is still folded up inside of it. Then the big thing was getting the sun shields deployed, and that's the stuff down here, this accordion-looking thing. 5 layers, extremely thin material. It's 0.002 inches, like this is like the thickness of a human hair kind of a dimension, but it's the size of a tennis court. So this is very, very thin film, and there's 5 layers of it. The idea is that any heat, it kind of bounces around, and the layers actually get a little bit wider as they get close to the edge. And so eventually that heat finds its way out. Unfolding those things was the biggest single risk in this entire project. And they completed it. It was about 75% of all the single point failures that could have happened are taken care of at that point. It's so complicated because there's 139 release mechanisms, there's 70 hinges, there's 8 motors, 400 pulleys, 90 cables, and a total length of about a quarter mile of cable. The whole thing was very, very complex. It's actually kind of amazing that it all worked, and it did. Obviously, they worked very, very hard on this to make it happen. They finished deploying the sun shields. They had, which meant opening them up and then putting tension on them, so they're all stretched out, where they're supposed to be. The secondary mirror was deployed. Again, that's the one shown up there on that diagram. And as of yesterday, they had started opening up the primary mirror. It was really folded into 3 sections. So they've opened up the left-hand side of it in that picture. They did that yesterday, and today they're doing the right-hand side. With some luck, again, that'll all be done today.
According to a half hour ago, the right side unfolded correctly, properly, and they were 16 blocks out of 20 and locking it in the final position as of an hour ago.
Yeah, so real time, this is still happening, and it's still looking good. The other good news about this thing is that the launch was extremely accurate, meaning it went exactly where it was supposed to, at exactly the right velocity. And as a result, they think they probably have 10 years of fuel left instead of just the 5 that it was designed for. 5 years doesn't sound like a lot of time, and it isn't, but 10 years is obviously better. So they're pretty happy about that. Actually, one comment about that, even 5 years on this thing is worth more than 5 years on the Hubble Space Telescope, because the Space Telescope is circling the Earth. It has to deal with sunlight and everything else. There are a significant number of hours each day that the Hubble doesn't do anything. So 5 years of this is continuous. It's always working. There's no time effect. Okay, next item, the Parker Solar Probe. And they like to use the words, they touched the sun. And what does that mean? It means they went into the corona, which is really the place where the solar wind starts. Inside of that, there's a lot of charged particles moving around, most of which are just held there. And outside of that, it's whooshing out into the solar system. That is the area where it's mostly magnetic fields that dominate particle movement, because most of them are charged particles. And what we're talking about is something that's about 4.9 million miles from the sun's surface. Now remember, we're up 93 million miles. So we're talking about being in pretty close to the sun compared to where Earth is. And that boundary is very irregular. It bounces around and it's always in flux. And what they've done with this craft is they're spiraling in closer and closer. It's in an elliptical orbit. They do that because it's very, very tough conditions when you're close to the sun. So they don't do that for very long. They monitor, they take the pictures they're going to take, they get the measurements, and then it swings back out, way, way far away from the sun. And that's when they start transmitting the data back. So it kind of works out. It's very complicated, but it's decaying in. And then 2025 is a target when they'll get the closest that they were targeting. And that's within the 3.8 million miles. It takes them 24 orbits to do that over a period of 7 years. And they're using Venus to help out. Every time they go around, they pass Venus. And normally you look for gravity assist to give you a boost in speed. Here they're doing the opposite. They're actually doing it to slow them down. They just made sure that the way they were going was the opposite direction of Venus, so they could actually slow down. So what are they doing? They're measuring temperatures, they're measuring the flow of charged particles and the angles, density, magnetic fields, and so on. Why do they do that? Well, ultimately, they want to understand the sun, how the sun works. There's a lot of unknowns in there, but more practical standpoint, you have space weather. Space weather basically means the solar winds more than anything else. There's always a lot of events that can cause all kinds of havoc on communication satellites and for astronauts. And so the more they understand about this, the more they hope to be able to predict more early when things are going to happen. Now, the obvious question here is, why doesn't the thing melt? It's in there pretty darn close to the sun, under 4 million miles. And usually you read these reports, people talk about the corona is really hot. It's 1 million or 2 million degrees. It's in that kind of a range. You go, well, how could anything stand 1 million or 2 million degrees? Well, that's true, but you're talking about a lot of individual particles. It's not very dense there. It's not that different than outer space. So if you think about how is heat transmitted? Well, radiation is the big one here. The other way is conduction and convection. There's no conduction because there's no solid surfaces touching each other. You're just talking about hitting an occasional molecule that has a lot of energy, but that's not very much. So actually getting the heat from that 1 million degree Fahrenheit occasional particle doesn't do much of anything. What does matter is radiation, and that's 475 times what you have on Earth. There's an inverse square law kind of thing. The closer you get to the sun, the worse and worse the radiation gets. So they have to have a heat shield. And so what happens is you look at the diagram on the right, that's showing the spacecraft. At the bottom of it, there's a circular heat shield that's pretty much protecting everything. That has to be kept oriented toward the sun at all times, so it's protecting the stuff behind it. It's 4.5 inches thick, and it's really 2 layers of pretty much just graphite, carbon kind of stuff like you might make golf clubs out of. And then there's a composite carbon foam in between that, kind of a sandwich. And then they put white ceramic paint on the very front. Sounds kind of simple, but it works quite effectively. It heats up to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit on the outside edge facing the sun, but it's only 85 degrees behind it. So it's quite effective. This depends on a couple things. One is keeping the thing oriented properly. You can imagine if that spacecraft even just tips a little bit, it's going to start to fry stuff, that's not supposed to get fried, all the electronics and so on. So what they do is they have 4 light sensors around the outside edges of the upper part of that craft. And whenever there gets to be a little bit more light than they're supposed to be, they adjust their orientation. They also do have radiator cooling, not that different than your car. It's pressurized, but not all that high pressure. Maybe it runs at like 260 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 212. So it's not that big a deal. There are a couple of instruments that are not protected by the heat shield. One in particular is called the solar cup. It's measuring the flow of electrons and the angles they hit at. So that has to be made of extremely high melting point alloys. So there's a couple of alloys there involved in the cup, and there's also an electric field generated as part of the sensor, and it has a grid to generate that field that's made of tungsten. That is the highest melting point metal. It takes like 6,000 degrees to melt that. So that's how they make this thing do its job. Also, the wires, you have to have wires going to these things. They make them out of niobium, which is used here on Earth for other things, but they suspend it in sapphire crystal tubes. I assume they grow them somehow. I don't even know how they do that. But so the whole thing ends up being kind of exotic, but what they've done is they've managed to really protect this craft from the sun. The first time it went into Corona, I think actually was back in April, and then it just passed through again in December. But what happened, the reason we're talking about this now is that NASA just held a press conference about it to release some of the results, mostly actually from the April pass through. Okay, on a completely different topic, China. They've talked about building a lunar base, also in conjunction with the Russians. And they have decided to move it up by 8 years. So they had a press conference and they announced it's a fairly drastic change because they were targeting 2035. Now they're going for 2027. They're pretty obviously trying to compete with the Artemis program, which is led by the US. They're doing some things differently. For one thing, they're just going to the moon. They're not doing this separate thing of putting up a gateway, basically a station orbiting the moon. They're just going to go there. So they're doing it a little bit differently. They're also going to have an automated mobile station. And their idea is they're kind of worried. They think that the US and the US companies are pretty much going to try to take over the moon. And so the way the outer space treaty works is apparently, you can't really own any of it, but if you're there, you're not supposed to interfere with it. And so they're essentially going to be trying to challenge any US equipment that lands there. That's their plan. And that's why they're actually having a mobile station. Now, this is just in their plans, and we don't know what they'll end up finally doing, but that's their plan. One thing they've talked about is exploring caves more as a place to look for permanent habitation. They found a lot of them on the far side of the moon, apparently, and they're going to do the same kind of thing here. Now, before that, of course, they're going to have the robotic missions. So those have been on their schedule all along for a similar time period. Those all target the South Pole. The poles are the most strategic areas at the moon. If you want to occupy space somewhere on the moon, it's there. There's a lot of reasons for it. One is the day-night cycle. The night lasts a couple of weeks on the moon, which says if you're working off of solar power, then you got to have an awful lot of battery storage to last through the night. But if you're down at the pole, you can basically just stick solar cells up in the air and they'll be exposed to the sun 24 hours a day. So it's very, very strategic. And that's why they want to be sure to get some equipment there. They're kind of afraid we're going to dominate that and just fill it all in. By the way, I skipped over it in this slide. They are planning for their station to be nuclear powered. They're talking about putting a megawatt reactor up there as part of this project. So anyway, that's what they're doing. Yeah.
How credible do you think the 2027 data is?
I don't know. They're not talking about putting astronauts there necessarily in 2027, but they're talking about landing some stuff anyway. Landing doesn't sound like it'd be that hard, but I think maybe 2030 is maybe when they're talking about having the astronauts show up. You never know. I mean, is it credible? Yeah, 20, 30, 40%. But they've definitely staked out their position, and the timing for any space-related activity, who knows? Our own programs as well as theirs often get behind by years.
They've really made a lot of progress in the last 5 years with their space station program.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Just the fact they got a space station up there and have already added a module to it. That's one of the highlights, in fact. But well, also not to mention, sending a rover to the far side of the moon and retrieving samples, and putting up a satellite for communications, in a halo orbit. I mean, they've done a lot of things on the moon that go way beyond what we've done. So pretty impressive, actually. So looking back at 2021, record numbers of space missions, and I have some counts in a later slide about that. 3 Mars missions arrived, us, China, and the UAE, including 2 rovers, China and the US, and our helicopter, as well, that went along with our rover. NASA, actually, you might say they had a banner year in a lot of areas besides Mars. They went out and they took samples at an asteroid called Bennu, and with a probe called the OSIRIS-REx, and started their flight back home with that sample. So they've succeeded with that. The Parker Solar Probe we just talked about, they launched a bunch of major missions. Lucy, which is going to explore the asteroids around Jupiter. DART, which is their test of impacting an asteroid to try to knock it out of its orbit, or at least to change its orbit, ultimately as practice for planetary defense, and that becomes necessary. They put up a new kind of telescope. It's an X-ray telescope. It's polarized X-rays, and I'm not even sure what that means, but it's supposed to give a whole new view of the universe. They can detect different kinds of events than they've been able to before. And the James Webb Space Telescope, of course, we just talked about that. We talked about the Chinese space station. It was launched, and they've added a module, and they've occupied it, with astronauts. So they're moving along fast. Russia did add a science module to the ISS, the Nauka module. Suborbital tourism started, and that may not leave any permanent artifacts, but at least it's activity that's space related. Several new companies reached orbit, and Astra and Virgin Orbit in particular. They're small launch companies. They're have various ways of getting satellites up in small sizes. And Starship from SpaceX, that is really sort of the upper stage of the final thing, but that's what's been tested. They finally managed to take it up and land it without blowing it up. They had a lot of very entertaining explosions before that, as we all had seen. There are lowlights too. We don't just have highlights in space, we have lowlights. Delays in the SLS, the Boeing Starliner, the Blue Origin rocket engines. They've been building this BE-4 engine for a while. That impacts not just their New Glenn rocket, it also impacts the Vulcan rocket, which is the next generation from United Launch Alliance. So that is actually having a big effect in slowing things down.
Would you say that the engine, what about the engine?
The BE, I think it's the BE-4. It just keeps getting delayed. They just haven't delivered it. Yeah. I don't know if they have any specific, at least I don't know if they publicize specific problems. I haven't looked at it that closely. It's been running behind, yeah. Well, and there have been press conferences about that, and they were defended, actually. Interestingly, the United Launch Alliance, said, oh no, they're doing fine, but there has to be tension there because it is holding them up. Yeah.
It's funny, on Blue Origin's website, you can now buy a New Glenn rocket, and it says no BE-4 engines coming.
Yeah, it's really funny. So you can buy a model of the rocket, and sure enough, it doesn't have the engines, just like reality. Yeah. And Blue Origin also had a low light associated with the human landing system for Artemis, which is getting from lunar orbit down to the surface. They lost the contract for that, and they've gone through several generations now of legal maneuvers to try to stop it and somehow get awarded the contract again. Those all failed, but it cost at least 7 months to the schedule. So it was kind of a handy thing for people to point to. Just last month we talked about this. The Russians' anti-satellite missile tests spread debris all over the place, requiring a space station, our space station, to maneuver to avoid it. And actually, the Chinese space station, I think they didn't end up maneuvering to avoid that Russian debris. However, a couple Starlink satellites have caused them problems. And these were Starlink satellites that were in a higher orbit that were coming down, and apparently were projected to come awfully close. At least one of those was coming pretty close, so they moved. They're making a big deal about this. It seems like, China in a lot of ways, they're resorting to what they or other people call lawfare. You don't necessarily have to have hostile, military actions. You can also try to slow things down from the people that you don't like by legal maneuvers. And there is a space treaty that we've all signed that says we're supposed to respect each other's stuff and take nice steps. Then there's no enforcement mechanism or anything, but there's sort of an intent there. And in particular, they've highlighted risk to astronauts as their thing. They're saying we've endangered them. And it's really, yes, it's Starlink, which is SpaceX, but they're saying, well, ultimately, according to the treaty, any private companies, their responsibility for their problems ultimately falls back to the nation where they're registered, which is us. So they're making a big deal about this. They might do a lot more of that sort of thing. It's quite possible. And at the International Space Station, it is aging. It's just getting old. The Russian modules in particular have cracks and leaks in them. And this is not actually a criticism of the Russian engineering. It's simply those were the first modules that were built and launched. And so it's kind of logical that they would be the first to have trouble as well. Now, on the other hand, there is places where you can blame the Russians, and that's that they fired thrusters which destabilized the orbit of the International Space Station, started the thing rotating. In one case, it rotated a couple of times. You can definitely blame them for that. And they've done it twice now, presumably an accident, but one way or another, they're getting sloppy, either sloppy or deliberate. Either way, it's not good. So you can take a step back and look at the trends that are going on in space missions. The biggest single one is probably the rapid ascent of the Chinese space program. We just talked about that, putting up space stations. They have lots and lots of different kinds of rockets, programs for the moon and so on. And the other big one is really how SpaceX is kind of dominating everything with the Falcon 9. If you look at the US missions alone, there were 51 during this last year. 31 of those were on a Falcon 9 and they all succeeded. They also, to launch those 31 missions, they only needed 2 new first stage rockets. So they have really proven once and for all that reusability really does work, and they've made it work. Nobody believed it was going to work. They did. There's also been the rise of some newer companies that mostly doing small kind of stuff like Rocket Lab. They've had 6 launches, and I mentioned Astra and Virgin Orbit. They've actually put things into orbit as well. Virgin Orbit, by the way, is a sister company of Virgin Galactic. They're 2 different companies. Galactic is the one that's, ironically enough, not getting up to orbital level, whereas the Orbit, it goes to orbit. There's a whole lot of other companies that have been rising for space-based services. And it's kind of like there's the gold rush in California, and the old story is don't go for the gold, go for the picks and shovels. Well, they're trying to be the picks and shovels. They're saying we just take it for granted there's going to be a much, much cheaper access to space. What are we going to do with that? And so you have all kinds of services coming up, and that includes things like the internet service. It includes things, a whole variety of things. I have another slide with that. So in general, there's a profusion of satellites out there, especially in low Earth orbit. In the old days, you had a few really expensive communication satellites up in very high orbits, geosynchronous orbits, 22,000 miles. Most of the emphasis now is on low Earth orbit, a little bit in medium Earth orbit as well. And in particular, a whole lot more small satellites. When they first came out with CubeSats, these are things that are like, 4 inches, 4-inch cubes. And multiples of that. You may have like a 6 cube, size or something. And everybody thought, wow, those are really small. And then a company called Swarm came out with ones that are a quarter of the size of that. They're the size of a sandwich. And they put up a couple hundred satellites, a company called Swarm that nobody ever even heard of probably until SpaceX bought them. So SpaceX apparently thinks that there's something a lot more they can do with that. But the point is, there's a whole lot more satellites going up all the time.
Regarding the timing of this, is that the rise of new companies providing services in space and satellite constellations, I remember that this concept first gained traction around 1997 with Iridium, the Iridium satellite constellations. So there seems to be about a 20-year time lag here in this industry.
Yeah.
At least in some categories.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Iridium case is interesting because they went bankrupt, but then they immediately came right back. Actually, the people who ran it, they just bought it themselves for $25 million. And this is for the 80 satellites or whatever, they're already up there, ground facilities. They got that at a steal. I mean, and they were able to make a business run. They're still in existence today. They haven't really expanded it much. Somehow they missed, I don't know what happened, a failure of vision or something, but they're still there. They're doing more limited kind of communications, focusing on voice, basically your satellite handheld phones. But they were the first of the big constellations with they had 66 or whatever it is satellites in low Earth orbit. So expectations for 2022, what's coming up? Well, a whole lot more launches. Some estimates, I think it was Eric Berger of Ars Technica, he estimated 150. I've seen several people estimating that, so we're getting more launches going on. There's certainly more competition just in the rockets alone that are coming along if they stay on schedule. Now, they don't all stay on schedule, but just what's coming. Of course, the SpaceX with their Starship should achieve orbit this year. That one's truly dramatic just because they're promising really, really reduced costs for access to space. I mean, at least a factor of 4, maybe up to a factor of 10, somewhere in that range. And partially because it's bigger, partially because the whole thing is reusable as opposed to just the first stage like we have with the Falcon 9. The next thing is the Chinese and the European have recognized that reusability is important. They've been working, Europeans are doing a craft called the Ariane 6, which is supposed to be reusable. That may or may not happen this year, but at least it's coming along. The Chinese are doing that. They recognize that they need to do this too, and I'm not clear on what their plans are. It's hard to understand their program. They have, maybe 8 or 10 different kinds of rockets, most of which are called Long March something or other, and they're all completely different. I mean, some are solid fueled, some are liquid fueled, some are mobile launchers, some are from major launch sites and so on. Anyway, the new rocket's coming along. We talked about Starship, which is the combination of, now it's really the upper stage of what they've tested, and Super Heavy, which is the huge booster that hasn't been tested yet. SLS, the Space Launch System, that's the big NASA program that's been in the works for a while. The Vega C is another European effort. Ariane 6 we talked about. H3 is Japanese, the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. They've been launching with earlier H2 something or others, and they just have a new version coming along. Terran 1, this is the one from Relativity Space. This one's financed. This is another one of those billionaire finance kind of things in conjunction with Fidelity Investments and some others. That one's special because the whole thing is done as a 3D printed thing, almost all just from one material. And then the Vulcan rocket from United Launch Alliance. That's another one that may or may not make it. That's more iffy, again, partially because of the fact that the Blue Origin engines have been delayed so long. The other big thing coming up that people haven't quite caught up with is a lot of moon missions coming. We focused on the lunar landing, but really Artemis 2 includes, Artemis 1 includes moon missions because there's a lot of small satellites that get spewed off as part of that launch. And then they go and they land on the moon, and there's landers and all kinds of things going on, up to 9 moon missions this year. Again, robotic, not all of them are landing, but some of those are landers. Okay, what else is coming along? I mean, these are obvious sort of trends, but basically a lot more commercial activities, more space-based services, especially in low Earth orbit. Internet service, Starlink has been in beta mode for quite a while now. It's their internet service, and they're expanding that, and that'll get bigger and bigger. OneWeb is their most active competitor right now. They're actually a medium Earth orbit satellite, so they have longer time delays because they're up higher, but they don't need so many satellites. And they put up quite a few satellites. They'll be offering service this year, I believe. Monitoring Earth, it was basically also called Earth observation. This is really the big area of growth. We had communications, and everybody knows about that with the internet satellites and so on. But the monitoring is really an area that's growing. We talked a little bit about this last time, and everybody still focuses on the, okay, intelligence services will buy satellite time to find out, who's building what out there in the desert somewhere. What they really are trying to sell is answering questions like, how many cars are parking in Walmart each day? Now, who wants to know that? Well, if you're an investor trying to beat the market a little bit, if you're in like a hedge fund or something, or if you're a competitor to a Walmart, you want to know, you estimate how busy are these stores, and you can do that. You can ask that question, and you'll have satellites passing maybe even more than once a day over the parking lots at any particular place on Earth. And you can answer questions like that. And there are companies now, I'll list 3 of them here: Planet Labs, Black Sky, and Maxar. All of them have satellites constellations up there. Planet Labs actually has almost 200 of those satellites. Maxar, I'm not sure how many they have. Black Sky has maybe 12. But they're all offering the service, and they offer not only the imaging, to get those questions, but they also offer analytic services to really more directly answer the question, because there've been an awful lot of data, and they're offering more than just the pictures. They're offering the service to answer specific questions, so as well. The other kind of services growth is in-orbit servicing, moving satellites. We talked before about Northrop Grumman has taken an old communications satellite up in geosynchronous orbit that had run out of fuel. Fuel is needed to keep it in position. And they basically just attached themselves to it, and they're doing the moving now because the satellite was fine except for loss of fuel. So that's an example of the use of that. Space junk, of course, is getting more and more attention, and that means capturing it and moving it. If it's in low Earth orbit, they want to deorbit it. If it's in high Earth orbit, they'll actually move it to an even higher one just to get it out of the way so it doesn't crash into things you care about. And the other one is space tugs. They can be used for some of the previous applications I mentioned there, but also they can be used during deployment of satellites in the first place. Right now, SpaceX runs these missions where they'll launch maybe 150 satellites for different people. And what they really do, they go up in one fell swoop. They release these space tugs, and the space tugs then take the the satellites to the orbits that people actually want, because they don't all want the same orbits. And this way, they get the economies of scale of getting up, up into the atmosphere. That's where most of the cost goes. The maneuvering costs a lot less, and so they can do that. That's how actually the small launch companies are kind of worried about this, because their big thing is they can launch small satellites, at the drop of a hat, but it costs more. And so there's this kind of war going on. And it remains to be seen who's going to win, the small launch companies or the bigger ones like SpaceX in conjunction with these launch techniques like space tugs. The other big thing coming is just more conflict over utilization. Again, conflict can be legal, it doesn't have to be military. But certainly the space race is pretty clearly between China and US at this point, without a doubt. I mean, Russia's there, but because China has the economy for it and they are developing the technology at a much more rapid pace. The Russians are kind of a third player and all that. There's a lot more concern over space junk and avoiding collisions and hardening systems in general, whether that's hardening them from ground-based lasers shooting at them just to try to blind them temporarily, or being able to move out of the way. The big thing is just moving out of the way of satellites that are coming at you. That's going to happen more and more just accidentally, as well as possibly on purpose. The other interesting thing is the military is relying more and more on commercial services. For instance, they actually want to look and have the Starlink satellites also supply GPS services instead of just relying on a couple of high value satellites that they do now. Okay, this brings us to a part of the meeting where we ask, how many launches do you think there have been since the last meeting? The last meeting was on December 11th. Okay, maybe just a quick survey. How many think there were more than 15? How about less than 10? Nobody. Well, okay, it's in that range. Actually, the answer is 12. By the way, that picture is from Vandenberg Air Force Base. You don't think about them very often. Usually I think of, Cape Kennedy, Cape Canaveral. But a lot of the polar orbits, in this case, some of the satellites going up for SpaceX are launched from Vandenberg. And that's California. So I'm not going to go into any detail on these. They're just more or less the standard ones or things that we've already mentioned. So I'm going to skip right over those. But maybe what might be interesting is a summary for the entire year. Now, this is actually just based on the ones that I had reported. And I found one other source that tries to do a total of these. It's actually cited in our technical article. And my numbers pretty much match except on China. Sometimes the Chinese don't announce all of their launches. Sometimes they don't announce them at all, or they announce them late. So there's more room for variation there. By the ones we reported in the space news, the US had slightly more launches than China did. However, probably the other one's right. Actually, there might be as many as 56 that came out of China, in which case they would actually be the #1 rocket launcher in the world right now. Then it's followed by Russia with 24 launches, Europe 6, and then a few minor players like India. So out of the total is 134 launches this year, or maybe 142. It's in that range, up to 142, 144 on by some other people's estimates. Basically, we're in record-breaking territory at this point, especially assuming that my China count is low. That means we passed all previous records. The previous number of launches maximum was back in 1967 with 139. And the previous number of successful launches was in 76 with 125. And this year we blew through both of those, assuming China is actually the higher count than I had reported on. Okay, discussion and questions before we move on to our guest.
2 of those launches out of China, it said, were for automated vehicles. There it is, third one down, Huizhou, China.
Yeah. Geely, is their auto company. Yeah, this shows you. People tend to think of China, in the old days, the way we used to think of Japan a long time ago, as being kind of just a copycat. They're going well past that at this point. I mean, here they have what are their version of private companies. Yeah, they were looking for things to support autonomous driving. Now that launch happened to fail, but no doubt they'll try again. Geely, besides making cars, they in fact have a space division as well. And China's a tough one to figure out because they have the ones that have the purely state-owned companies, and those are clearly government. And then they have the so-called private companies, which are kind of like our private companies, but the reality is the thumb of the government is still on them in a much more heavy way. And so it's a little bit hard to even assign, state versus private enterprise in their case. So you have companies like Geely that do get involved. I think they own, is it Volvo? They own other car makers that that you've heard of. Geely maybe not so much.
And the big one, the Angara 5A was, that's their new replacement for their, for the Proton rocket.
Yeah.
It's a new heavy lift rocket.
Yeah, and this particular test failed, so they're falling behind a little bit.
Yeah.
There was apparently in the Russian press, there were actually articles about how the Soviet program is in disarray at this point. And that's pretty amazing because this is in the Russian press, which is of course pretty tightly controlled by the government. And even they allowed that to be published. So
was there any sort of reason or why it was not being funded?
don't know. I didn't read the details of that.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
I guess who has the jurisdiction over the moon? So they are going to the moon. Who gets the permit? And this
Yeah.
doesn't belong to everybody, right?
Well, yes and no. The problem is there's multiple treaties involved here. There's the Outer Space Treaty, which goes back to 67 or whatever. And it says that governments can't own the moon or anything in space really, but it doesn't really talk about private companies. And so it's not clear, but then there's a separate thing, which is the Moon Treaty, where they say it's the common heritage of mankind, everybody owns it, and all the resources should be split up somehow. All the major space powers, except maybe France or somebody, didn't sign that. So there is a treaty called the Moon Treaty, but all the people that actually are going to space refused to sign it because they realized they would never have any incentive to do anything, if they had to then figure out how to distribute that to every country in the world. So they just said, no, we're not doing that. So the real answer in practice is kind of nobody. I think the Outer Space Treaty it provides a general framework, saying that, for instance, and there's the Artemis Accords, which we layered on top of that, which makes it explicit that people can extract materials from the moon and sell them, but you don't own the underlying land, but you can still do the extraction. And so that allows companies or governments, to land something, extract, whatever ore or whatever you want to do from, say, the surface of the moon, and go on. And the big thing is just you don't really interfere with each other too much. You're supposed to respect, other people's stuff. But there's no enforcement mechanism in any of it in any case. So it doesn't have any real teeth. So it's a hard question to answer. So it has been thought about. There's several different conflicting treaties, or it's not conflicting. The Moon Treaty is much more restrictive, saying that everybody owns it. But when you say everybody owns it, it kind of means nobody owns it, because nobody will invest the effort if they're afraid that 95% of it's going to go to somebody else. So.
I have a question. What would it happen if a meteorite hits the moon, huge meteorite, and I don't know, maybe take it out of orbit or something? What will happen there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends how big it is. The bigger it is, the more impact it can have. So it's probably still not as bad as hitting the Earth, but.
Yeah, actually, a big meteorite did hit the moon in sometime in the last 2 years, and it was pretty sizable. And someone happened to be looking at the moon, and they had a video camera on when they saw the flash. And there were no satellites at that point that were supposed to be doing burns, so it was an impact. And they estimated it was probably the size of a car or the size of a pickup truck or something. When they hit the moon and it flashed for just a second and then gone. But I mean, it is happening. It's happening in real time. It's happening probably while we speak. There's there's meteors that are the size of a pea or the size of a marble, and they're happening a whole lot, very frequently. And that's one of the reasons why the Chinese are interested in exploring latitudes on the moon, because then you basically can go live in a tunnel that's already covered with concrete, essentially, regolith, and you don't have to worry about the little ones. But yeah, there's still going to be a problem. The bigger the pieces are, there is no atmosphere around the moon to help them burn up on the way down, like that one that came down over Russia here about 3 years ago.
Yeah, that was,
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, it's going to be an issue. And of course, if it's a really big one, like a kilometer across, well, that's a whole other level of, it could spit chunks back up that could then end up coming back towards the Earth. But we've never observed that.
and we hope we don't.
And we hope we don't. Yeah.
Just ask the dinosaurs.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so at that point, I guess we'll move on to our features. Now, normally we say featured speaker. In this case, it's more of a question and answer kind of format. But I'll set the stage here. Jeff Perkins, he's a systems engineer at Lockheed Martin Space Systems here in Houston, and he's responsible for the technical integrity of the Orion spacecraft. And looking back, I think you were also involved in Europe as well, right? I noticed you were in Bremen. Bremen is where they're doing the service module part of it. So he's seen quite a few aspects of Orion. He had previously worked on the F-35 for Lockheed Martin in the aeronautics division, a different division. He has a BS in electrical engineering from Texas A&M and an MBA from the University of Dallas. So his topic is Orion spacecraft, and I'll just to set the stage quickly here. There's three main parts to that. You can think of it. There's the crew module, which is where people would actually be. That's here. And then you see there's this giant latch kind of holding it onto the service module. The crew module, I guess, is built here by Lockheed. The service module is actually called the European Service Module, ESM, because it's built in Germany. There's also a launch abort system, which kind of goes on top of the crew module. And that's used in case there's any kind of a problem in the beginning in particular. It fires some rockets to take it off, take the astronauts off and land them safely somewhere. So those are the three parts. We're showing them here, in this case, stacked, ready to go on top of the SLS. Here, this would be in space with the service module providing, power and, life support and so on. And the crew module mainly would be for when you're ready to descend into the atmosphere, it separates and it comes down. And so those are sort of three different phases of the life cycle of an Orion. And with that, let's talk about Orion.